A wounded Arapaho elder collapsed at the doorstep of a hermit's cabin, and that single act of compassion nearly cost Zach Harper everything. The Black Banner, ruthless mercenaries hired by the railroad, came to burn him out and silence anyone who stood in their way. But Zach had more than traps and bullets. He had a lantern that lit the path for a people long hunted in the dark. Just wait until you see how this battle turned and why justice, in the end, burned brighter than fear. Zach Harper had lived alone for 9 years by the time the wind shifted that spring. His cabin sat nestled between the jagged roots of Snake Ridge, where the pine trees grew tall and thin like needles threaded into the sky, and the soil held memories older than the railroads. He hadn't spoken to another soul in over a year, not since he sold his last mule to a wandering trader and turned away before the man could thank him. Zach didn't need thanks. He didn't need people. After the war, after all the screaming, he had put his name, his debt, and every man-made thing he ever cared about behind him. The West gave him quiet, and quiet was the only companion he trusted. The mountain didn't ask questions, it only listened. The owls blinked at him in the evenings. The wind hissed secrets in the branches. His horse, Cole, sometimes nudged his shoulder with a quiet breath, just to remind him he still had a heartbeat. But one evening, in the third week of March, 1874, a sound came that did not belong to the mountain. It was not a knock, not exactly. It was a scrape, brittle and slow, like bone dragged across wood. Zach stood by the stove, sharpening a small blade when the noise came again. He reached for his lantern but didn't light it, not yet. He opened the door, and there, leaning against the frame like a dead tree half felled, was an old Arapaho man, barely clinging to the living world. The man collapsed forward without a word. Blood soaked through his deerskin tunic, and across his bare chest was something Zach would never forget. A burn mark carved in the shape of an iron spike, the kind used to lay railroad track. It had been pressed deep into his flesh, still smoldering at the edges. Zach caught him before he hit the floor. The man's name came out in a whisper. Mikavo. His voice trembled like water over stone. Zach didn't ask who hurt him, didn't ask why he came. Some things a man doesn't need to ask. He carried the wounded elder inside, laid him gently on a bed of hides near the stove, and lit the kerosene lantern. Then, without a word, he stepped outside and hung the lantern above his door. In those mountains, a lit lantern meant one thing. Someone inside needed help. It was a symbol older than the sheriff's badge, older than the telegraph wires stretching east. It was a code among the mountain folk, respected even by those who didn't believe in codes anymore. The unspoken law was clear. You don't harm a home where a lantern burns. But not everyone followed law. The sun dipped behind the ridge like it didn't want to see what came next. Night fell quickly in those hills, and with it came the riders. Zach first noticed them when the owls stopped hooting. Then from the trees, black shapes began to emerge, silent, no torches, no voices, just horses gliding over snow like ghosts, and long coats that brushed the stirrups. He stood at the window and watched them circle the edge of the clearing. His fingers tightened around the curtain. He could see their silhouettes, each marked with the same sign on their belt buckles, an iron cross, narrow and sharp. Zach had heard of them. They called themselves the Black Banner, a private group paid by the Wyoming Central Rail Company. Their job wasn't laying track. It was clearing land, which meant moving people off it by any means. Settlers, tribes, holdouts, anyone not under contract. He knew what it meant that Mikavo was marked with a railroad spike. It meant the old man had stood in their way, and now, by taking him in, so had Zach. He stepped away from the window and moved toward the stone fireplace. On the mantel, covered in dust and silence for years, lay a rifle. A Spencer repeating rifle. He hadn't held it since the war, hadn't needed to. He took it down slowly. Near the stove, Mikavo stirred. The old man's eyes fluttered open, searching, not afraid, just tired. Zach knelt beside him. "They're coming," he said simply. Mikavo nodded once, as if he already knew. Zach stood and turned toward the door. "I don't know what brought you to me," he muttered, more to the wind than the man. "But I reckon I'm the last wrong tree they'll bark up tonight." He moved to the door, lantern still glowing above it like a beacon, a warning, a promise. And maybe, just maybe, a line no one should cross. Zach had fought for the South. He didn't talk about it, not even to himself. But the weight was still there, in the way his hands moved, steady and without tremor, and how he always kept his rifle oiled and the stock polished though he never used it. His fingers still remembered how to load and fire in darkness, how to breathe before pulling the trigger, how to tell mercy from a mistake. After Appomattox, he'd made a quiet promise to the mountains and to whatever pieces of God still watched him. He would never fire first again. He'd done enough damage in one lifetime. He came to Snake Ridge to forget, but the past never really lets go. That night, with Macavo wheezing near the fire and snow thick against the windows, Zach knew a line had been crossed. Not by him, but it would cost him all the same. He slid aside the floorboards at the center of the cabin, revealing a narrow, hollow space beneath. Once, long ago, it had hidden a satchel of gold bars left behind by a Mormon courier who never returned. Zach had kept it secret, never spending a coin. Now the gold was gone, traded for food, bullets, and the years. But the space remained. He helped Macavo down into the shadows, laying him on an old wool blanket. The old man's breath rattled, but his eyes were clear. Zach handed him a canteen, then shut the boards, placing a bearskin rug over the seam. Then he lay down on the cold floor, facing the door, with his Spencer resting against his chest like a memory. He didn't sleep. He listened. The quiet broke just after midnight. It began with a low glow beyond the pines. Then, without warning, the barn burst into flames. The dry wood snapped and roared. Cole, his horse, screamed in panic. Not a sound of anger, but fear, raw and wild. Zach sprang to his feet, every part of him moving before thought could catch up. He raced outside, snow burning cold under his bare feet, heart pounding in his chest like a drum in a funeral procession. He grabbed a pail and lunged toward the well, but he never made it. A sharp sting exploded in his shoulder. He didn't hear the shot until after it hit. The force spun him sideways, and he landed hard in the snow. The air left his lungs in one rush, and for a moment, the world narrowed to a tunnel of stars. He clawed at the ground, trying to rise, but the pain folded him in half. Only the darkness saved him, the night and the smoke. The riders, thinking him finished, didn't come closer. They ransacked the cabin. Zach lay still as glass, breathing shallow in the snow, watching their boots pass just feet away. Voices barked orders, rough, impatient southern accents layered over frontier sharpness. They kicked open crates, flipped his cot, checked under the table. But they didn't find the hollow floor. Macavo was safe. For now. Minutes later, they vanished back into the trees, dragging his provisions and whatever they thought might be useful. They didn't torch the cabin. Maybe because of the lantern still hanging. Maybe because they didn't think he was worth the effort. By the time Macavo emerged, the barn had collapsed into cinders. Zach's lips were blue and his shirt soaked through with blood. Macavo knelt beside him without a word, tore cloth from his own tunic, and pressed it into the wound. He mixed dried leaves from a leather pouch and whispered in a language that sounded like the wind through pine needles. His hands were old, but sure. They knew how to care for others. Likely he'd done it more times than Zach could count. As the bleeding slowed and Zach drifted somewhere between fever and memory, he saw something in the old man's face that cut deeper than the wound. It wasn't fear. It was sorrow. A deep, ancient kind that spoke of more than pain. Macavo wasn't mourning himself. He was mourning something bigger, something already dying. Through blurred vision, Zach understood. This wasn't just about hiding a wounded elder. It wasn't even about revenge. The man under his roof was carrying the remnants of an entire people. Stories, memories, names, girls taken and never seen again. Boys who'd never become men. Villages erased before they could be mapped. And all that remained was this frail frame, bent over him, trying to keep a single flicker alive. At first light, Macavo returned from the creek with fresh water and boiled herbs. Zach, barely able to sit up, opened his eyes and tried to speak. But the old man shook his head. No need. Instead, he placed something into Zach's hand, a small pouch, worn and tied with sinew. This, Macavo rasped, is my father, and my son's grandfather. If I don't see the moon again, take it to Wind River. To my boy. You'll know him by the mark. 2 horns here. He pointed to the side of his neck. Zach stared at the pouch for a long time. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He had taken in a dying man. Now he carried a legacy. By the time the sky turned silver with the promise of another cold dawn, Zach Harper was already on his feet. The wound in his shoulder pulsed with every movement. His vision swam if he turned too quickly, and yet he moved with purpose. Slow, deliberate, steady. He knew pain. He had lived inside it once. Now it simply rode with him like an old passenger. He took it as a sign that he still had work to do. And he did. The Black Banner would return. They always did. So Zach began to prepare. First came the traps. He limped to the edge of the woods where the snow thinned and dug out 2 rusted bear traps from a crate buried beneath stones. With frozen fingers, he reset the springs, checked the teeth, and dragged them to the forest path that circled the cabin from the north. He buried them shallow beneath pine needles, in the same ground he once thought sacred. Now it was just tactical. Next, he unwound a spool of copper wire, salvaged from an old telegraph relay station, and stretched it across the perimeter in careful zigzagging lines. He wrapped it low around roots and fixed it to bell hooks he had scavenged years ago. If anyone moved too fast or too blind, they'd make noise, enough to buy seconds. Seconds were everything. Inside the cabin, he sat beside the fire and loaded the Spencer rifle with the last 3 rounds he had. Hand cast, shaped by fire and time, each one bearing his mark. He checked the sight. He checked the chamber. He didn't expect to survive a full siege, but he expected to make each shot matter. Before the sun dipped again behind Snake Ridge, he stepped outside and lifted the kerosene lantern once more. He hung it in the same place above the door. The same warm glow flickered into the dusk. But this time the lantern meant something different. He wasn't calling for help. He was calling for witnesses. The second night was quieter than the first. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes your skin listen. Then, just before midnight, Zach heard a slow crunch of snow. Not boots, not horses. Lighter, careful, from the direction of the canyon. A figure stepped into the clearing. It was a young man, tall, unarmed, wrapped in a tattered blanket. The firelight caught the side of his neck where a thick scar curled like antlers under the jaw. Zach stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready, the cold burning through his coat. The young man didn't flinch. "I am Tahoni," he said, voice calm. "Son of Mikavo." Zach looked him over, felt the tremor in his legs from fever and fatigue, but he didn't show it. He nodded once. Behind them, something shifted. The trees to the west moved, not with the wind, but with purpose. Riders. Dozens. Silent again, same as before. The Black Banner back to finish what they started. But this time, they weren't alone. Tahone raised his voice in his native tongue, one long rising cry that echoed through the canyon like a bell struck from stone. From behind the slope to the east, shadows moved, then more. One by one, 5 figures stepped into view, then 3 more, not soldiers, not fighters, but men, women, and children, each holding torches, each with scars of their own, across shoulders, across faces, across time. Their eyes did not burn with rage, but with memory. They had come not to fight, but to stand. Zach felt the weight of the moment settle around him. These weren't warriors trained in battle. They were survivors, the last remnants of a people being erased, one fire at a time. And now they stood shoulder to shoulder, not with weapons, but with stories, silence, and flame. The Black Banner hesitated, their horses stamped. They had expected another quiet burn, not this. Zach stepped forward, rifle at the ready. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The lantern glowed behind him. The people of Mikavo stood beside him. Then, somewhere in the darkness, a shot rang out. The first shot came from Zach's Spencer, and it dropped the lead rider before his horse even knew he was gone. The second was faster, reloaded and fired with the kind of clarity that only pain and purpose can give. A second man fell into the snow, twisting sideways with a stunned cry that vanished into the wind. Zach didn't pause. He shifted his stance, bracing against the doorframe, and pulled the trigger once more. The third bullet found its mark just before the chaos truly broke. The rest of the Black Banner scattered. Some turned their horses hard, spurring them into the woods. Others charged forward, confused, panicked, not realizing that Zach had prepared for this. One rider veered left and tripped the copper wire. The bells clanged once before he tumbled into a waiting trap. Another galloped straight into the false clearing Zach had raked with fresh snow to disguise the pit. His scream was brief, cut off by the impact and the snap of bone. Amid the confusion, Tahoni stood firm with his torch held high. He never lifted a hand to strike. That had never been his purpose. He had come to bear witness and shine light, literally and otherwise. He moved along the edge of the clearing, lifting the flame so the others could see where not to step, where not to fall. The people behind him, elders and children alike, stood still. They did not retreat. They simply watched. One of the last riders tried to push through the tree line on the southern ridge. His horse bucked as the trail narrowed, and the rider lost his footing. He tumbled sideways, landing in a shallow ditch with a sickening crunch. His scream echoed longer than the others. Zach recognized him immediately. The polished boots, the silver-plated rifle, the tailored coat. He was the judge's boy, the one whose family believed no law applied above the valley line. Now, lying in the snow with a broken leg and no one coming to help, he sobbed, not from the wound, but from the shock that no one had stopped to carry him. By dawn, the clearing was quiet again. Mikavo passed just before sunrise. He slipped away without sound, his breath fading into the morning frost. His hands were folded, his expression still. Zach sat beside him until the sun crested over the ridge, casting long light through the smoke-hazed trees. Then he rose and did what had to be done. He climbed to the ridge with a shovel and stones gathered by hand. It took him half the day to build the cairn, solid, round, and facing east. He laid Mikavo's pouch inside, just as promised. At the peak, he drove a stake into the ground and hung the kerosene lantern. It flickered even in daylight, as if it understood its purpose wasn't to burn, but to remain. It stayed lit for 3 days. No one came. Not a soul. The railroad company made its decision within the month. The Black Banner was deemed inefficient, too costly, too exposed. They scrapped the northern route and laid the tracks farther south, avoiding Snake Ridge entirely. Quietly, without ceremony, the operation was shut down. The judge, embarrassed by his son's failure and injuries, sent the boy east to Boston, enrolling him in a cloistered academy under a false name. No one mentioned the incident again. But Zach changed. He no longer lived in isolation. He took down the broken boards from the barn, raised a new structure by hand, and built a longhouse beside it. Survivors came, scattered members of the Arapaho, lost and wandering families who had no place left. He welcomed them, not as guests but as partners. Together, they planted, taught, healed. He called the place Lantern's Keep. They taught the children how to read, how to remember, how to speak not only English but the language their grandparents once whispered beside fires. They painted the stories on hide, then on paper. They lit lanterns at the edge of the forest so no child would ever feel alone in the dark. Zach Harper died in the winter of 1901, quietly, without pain. He was buried next to Mikavo's cairn on the ridge, beneath the wind and sky he had once believed belonged to no one. No name was carved into his grave, just one line, etched deep into the stone. Here stood a man who lit a light for another's soul. And even 100 years later, when snow falls thick over Snake Ridge and the nights stretch long, people still come. Not many, just enough. Descendants of Tahoni, children of those who remembered. They come on the winter solstice. They bring a lantern, and they light it. For whoever still needs to find their way through the dark.